Arthur Wright stepped out of the heavy, armored black sedan, his boots crunching softly on the pristine gravel driveway of his estate. His trusted chauffeur, Peter, immediately moved forward, reaching out an arm to take the heavy leather briefcase from his employer's hand, but Arthur stopped him with a sharp, dismissive gesture. It was a cold, detached habit that had clung to Arthur ever since he became a widower, exactly 2 years ago, a tragic loss that had turned his heart into a fortress of isolation. He was utterly exhausted, drained to his very marrow by the endless, cutthroat demands of presiding over the real estate market of New York City and its surrounding high-end territories. Being the undisputed king of a financial empire was a grueling, soul-crushing endeavor, especially when the destination at the end of the day was not a warm home, but a sterile monument to wealth. He walked slowly toward the towering main entrance of his residence, a sprawling architectural marvel nestled in the most exclusive enclave of Greenwich, Connecticut. The structure was an imposing fusion of ultra-modern glass panels and classical American manor design, boasting vast expanses of imported white marble, ceilings, and colossal windows that looked out into a dense, silent forest of ancient pine trees. Every single detail of the estate loudly screamed of immense wealth, yet not a single corner whispered a gentle word of welcome to the weary man who owned it. Arthur held his magnetic security card against the electronic scanner, listening to the sharp, high-pitched beep of the security system before pushing the massive oak doors open. He expected the usual, suffocating silence that always greeted him, a silence that reminded him of how empty his existence had truly become. His beautiful fiancée, Khloe, was almost certainly spending his hard-earned money at an exclusive, members-only club in Manhattan, or indulging in a ridiculously expensive spa treatment to pass the time. Meanwhile, his precious twin sons, Samuel and Logan, who were merely 3 years old, were likely locked away in their distant playroom on the upper floor, staring blankly at tablet screens, or forced into an early nap. This was the rigid, joyless routine that defined his household, a gray and predictable existence where appearances mattered far more than actual, human connection. Arthur carelessly tossed his heavy leather briefcase onto the polished floor of the grand foyer, the sharp impact of the expensive leather echoing loudly through the empty, cavernous hallways. He reached up to loosen the suffocating knot of his silk tie, taking a deep, ragged breath as if he were finally allowed to breathe, but that was the exact moment he heard it. It was a strange, rhythmic noise echoing from the deepest recesses of the long hallway, originating from the industrial kitchen that his family almost never utilized because they constantly ordered gourmet meals from Michelin-starred restaurants. Arthur instantly furrowed his brows in deep suspicion, his heart skipping a beat as a sudden surge of adrenaline rushed through his veins at the thought of an intruder. He reasoned that a bold thief might have cleverly broken into the mansion, ruthlessly exploiting the brief window of time when the private security detail was undergoing their scheduled shift change. He began to advance down the corridor with agonizing slowness, his expensive Italian leather shoes making absolutely no sound against the gleaming, flawless surface of the marble floor. As he drew closer to the wide kitchen doorway, the quality of the mysterious noise began to shift dramatically, transforming from metallic clatter into something entirely unexpected. It was no longer the sound of a dangerous intrusion, but rather the unmistakable, crystal-clear sound of vibrant, contagious laughter bubbling over from the throats of young children. Arthur froze completely in his tracks, his mind struggling to process the beautiful sound, because it had been many months, perhaps even years, since he last heard his boys laugh with such pure abandonment. Typically, whenever he returned home from a long business trip, Samuel and Logan were painfully quiet, terribly shy, and almost completely terrified of breaking the expensive ornaments that filled the house. But these sudden, joyous outbursts of genuine merriment and delightful giggles sounded like the very definition of pure, unadulterated life returning to his frozen home. Then, amidst the sweet chorus of childish laughter, he heard the soft, melodious voice of a young woman rising above the delightful din. It was definitely not the high-pitched, demanding, and constantly entitled voice of Khloe that usually filled the rooms with complaints and materialistic desires. This was a remarkably gentle, incredibly sweet yet beautifully firm voice that was cheerfully humming a lively, upbeat tune to keep the children entertained. Come on now, my favorite little master chefs, let us put some real strength into mixing this heavy batter, and do not be afraid to let the white flour fly into the air. The woman cheered happily. Arthur felt a strange, intoxicating mixture of utter confusion and intense curiosity washing over his cynical soul as he pressed his back flat against the cold wall just outside the kitchen doorframe. The rich, heavenly aroma hit his senses first, completely overpowering the usual scent of expensive chemical cleaners and sandalwood room fresheners that Khloe insisted on using. It smelled beautifully of sweet vanilla extract, rich melted butter, and the irresistible fragrance of fresh batter frying on a hot, sizzling pan. With his heart hammering violently against his ribs, Arthur slowly and cautiously peeked around the heavy doorframe to witness a spectacular scene that he never expected to see. The pristine clinical kitchen, which was normally a flawless exhibition of black granite countertops and stainless steel appliances, had been turned into a chaotic battlefield of joy. Fine white flour was scattered absolutely everywhere, dusting the dark floorboards, coating the leather chairs, and covering the surface of the massive kitchen island like a layer of fresh winter snow. Cracked eggshells were scattered carelessly across the long counter. An overturned carton of milk sat completely empty near the sink, and in the very center of this magnificent mess stood his twin boys. Samuel and Logan were standing proudly right on top of the expensive granite countertop, wearing matching cooking aprons that were several sizes too large for their tiny bodies. Their little hands and round faces were completely smeared with dark chocolate syrup and sticky pancake batter, creating a hilarious and heartwarming sight. Their cheeks, which Arthur was deeply accustomed to seeing pale and solemn, were now flushed bright red with pure excitement, sporting comical mustaches of white flour. Their eyes were wide, sparkling with a genuine, radiant happiness that all the expensive toys and trips to Disneyland could never hope to buy them. Standing right beside them, with her back completely turned toward the open hallway, was Victoria, the humble new maid whom his household had hired just one short month ago. Arthur had only caught fleeting glimpses of Victoria a handful of times during the past month, usually when she would politely lower her gaze and whisper a quiet greeting before disappearing into the background. But now, in the privacy of the kitchen, there was not a single trace of that timid shyness left in her vibrant demeanor. Victoria was a radiant young woman of perhaps 25 or 26 years of age, possessing a graceful figure that her plain blue domestic uniform could not entirely conceal. She was moving around the chaotic kitchen space with a wonderful, vibrating energy, her hands encased in bright yellow cleaning gloves that were completely caked in thick, wet batter. Her long hair, which she normally kept bound tight in a severe professional bun, had partially unraveled, letting several loose strands fall beautifully around her flushed face. "Watch out, Logan, or our magnificent pancake tower is going to come crashing down to the ground." Victoria screamed with laughter, skillfully catching a flying pancake in midair. Samuel was jumping up and down on the expensive marble surface, shouting at the top of his lungs, "My turn, Vicky. Let me do the next one, please." Victoria immediately caught him around his tiny waist with a remarkable strength and a deep, motherly certainty that completely hypnotized Arthur as he watched from the shadows. She lifted the young boy up into the air as if he weighed nothing more than a stray feather, positioning him perfectly so his small hands could reach the mixing bowl. Arthur found himself utterly unable to move a single muscle, paralyzed by the sheer emotional weight of the domestic scene unfolding right before his eyes. His highly rational, calculating mind, the mind of a seasoned businessman who spent his entire life assessing financial risks and profit margins, was screaming at him to intervene. It told him that his children were making an absolute disaster of the house, that standing on the high countertops was incredibly dangerous, and that this maid was flagrantly breaking every rule of employment. Yet his aching heart, which had been completely frozen in ice since the untimely passing of his beloved wife, felt a strange, long-forgotten warmth spreading through his chest. He was witnessing his children being truly deeply happy for the first time in 2 long years, finding immense joy not in wealth but in a simple mess of flour. Victoria turned her profile slightly to reach for a clean kitchen towel, allowing Arthur to catch a full, unobstructed view of her lovely, unadorned face. She possessed a striking, completely natural beauty that required absolutely no cosmetics, her smooth skin glowing radiantly from the intense heat of the stoves and the oven. But what truly rendered her the most beautiful woman Arthur had seen in years was not her physical features, but the incredible warmth of her smile. It was a completely sincere, boundlessly patient smile that was overflowing with genuine, unconditional love for the 2 boys placed in her temporary care. She gazed at the twins not as a detached domestic employee clocking in her required hours, but as someone who genuinely cherished their sweet, innocent presence. "Look at this one, my little angels," Victoria called out, making a comically exaggerated face that caused the boys to squeal with absolute delight. "I am entirely convinced that this specific pancake has accidentally taken the exact shape of a terrifying, roaring dinosaur from the prehistoric era," she exclaimed. "Roar," the twins bellowed at the top of their lungs in perfect unison, lifting their batter-stained arms into the air as they pretended to be wild beasts. Arthur felt a massive, painful lump forming in his throat, his eyes growing heavy with unshed tears as a wave of profound regret washed over him. He could not remember the last time he had lowered his guard to play with his own sons, or when his multi-million-dollar mansion had felt so incredibly alive. Suddenly, like a dark, suffocating cloud rolling into a bright sky, a cold and unsettling thought drifted across his mind, shattering the warmth of the moment. He thought of Khloe, his sophisticated fiancée, and he knew with absolute certainty that if she were to walk through the front doors right now, absolute hell would break loose. Khloe possessed an intense, obsessive hatred for any form of domestic disorder, and she absolutely despised it whenever the children made the slightest bit of noise. She was a woman who constantly reminded Arthur that the domestic staff should remain entirely invisible, treating them as nothing more than automated machines. But Khloe was miles away in the city, and for the very first time in a long while, Arthur felt profoundly grateful for his fiancée's absence. He remained completely hidden in the dim shadows of the long corridor, feeling like an uninvited intruder in his own home, watching the most beautiful spectacle of his life. It was a spectacle that was deeply beautiful because of the boundless love that was visibly overflowing from it, yet it was excruciatingly painful for Arthur to witness. It served as a brutal, unforgiving reminder of everything he had failed to provide for his young sons since their world had been torn apart by tragedy. It was also deeply painful because this humble young woman in yellow gloves was effortlessly stepping into an emotional void that should have been filled by a loving mother. Arthur tightly clenched his right fist, burying his short fingernails deep into the palm of his hand until it throbbed with a dull, grounding ache. He desperately wanted to step out of the shadows, to call out their names, and to wrap his arms around his sons, but he remained completely frozen. He watched with a heavy heart as Victoria took a soft paper towel, leaning forward with infinite tenderness to gently wipe a dark smudge of chocolate from Samuel's nose. The little boy, who normally rejected any form of physical contact from strangers and even pulled away from his own father, stood completely still for her. He closed his eyes with a sweet, serene smile, tilting his small head affectionately toward her gentle hand like a young kitten seeking warmth and security. This incredibly simple, effortless gesture of pure connection completely shattered the last remnants of Arthur's hardened exterior, breaking something deep within his chest. He suddenly remembered the cruel, dismissive words Khloe had uttered just the previous evening while they were dining at an incredibly expensive French restaurant downtown. Khloe had held a crystal glass of imported white wine in her manicured hand, speaking with an unmistakable sneer of utter disgust about his children. "Oh, Arthur, darling, those boys of yours are becoming completely unmanageable, and I truly believe they have severe behavioral issues that require professional intervention." She had sighed. "That sweet little maid we hired, Victoria, possesses absolutely no backbone or character, and we should immediately replace her with a strict, traditional European governess. Children require a firm, unyielding hand if they are ever going to learn proper manners," Khloe had demanded with an icy coldness that Arthur had ignored. But as Arthur stood staring into the messy, flower-covered kitchen, he realized with absolute clarity that a firm hand was the absolute last thing his boys needed. What his grieving sons truly required to heal was precisely what they were receiving right now. A love so deep that it didn't care about a messy floor. They needed someone who was willing to drop down to their level, to make mistakes with them, and to create a delicious, wonderful chaos out of nothing. "Vicky, Vicky, look out!" Logan suddenly screamed at the top of his lungs, frantically pulling at the hem of her stained blue apron. "The dinosaur is catching on fire, it is burning," he yelled, jumping up and down on his tiny feet with exaggerated panic. Victoria immediately leaped backward in a comically dramatic fashion, completely exaggerating her terror for the sole purpose of making the two boys laugh even harder. "Initiating emergency pancake rescue operation immediately," she announced in a booming voice that perfectly mimicked a dramatic radio broadcaster, saving the day. With a quick, incredibly practiced movement of her wrist, she expertly flipped the golden pancake away from the hot surface of the pan before it could burn. It landed perfectly on a growing stack of misshapen, uneven pancakes of various sizes, all of them looking entirely imperfect but crafted with pure love. "It smells so incredibly delicious," Samuel murmured softly, closing his eyes tightly as he inhaled the sweet, warm aroma that filled the entire room. It truly did smell heavenly, a comforting scent that stood in brutal, violent contrast to the cold, suffocating perfumes that Khloe always brought into the house. The beautiful scene before him felt so profoundly private and sacred that Arthur suddenly began to feel a deep wave of guilt for spying on them like a thief. It felt as though he were unworthily witnessing a holy ritual of healing that he had no right to disturb without warning, prompting him to retreat. Victoria leaned down slightly so that her eyes were perfectly level with the twins, her face beautifully illuminated by the soft afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows. "Very well, my brave little chefs," she whispered in a conspiratorial tone that made the boys lean in close to catch her every word. "Now it is time for us to add the top secret ingredient, the one special thing that makes these pancakes taste exactly like a piece of heaven." The twins shook their heads rapidly from side to side, their eyes wide with intense fascination, as they waited for her to reveal the great secret. Arthur found himself leaning forward just a fraction of an inch as well, completely captivated by her words and desperately wanting to know the answer. "The secret ingredient is—" Victoria paused for a long, highly dramatic moment before suddenly reaching out to tickle both of their bellies simultaneously. "An immense amount of pure love, followed by a generous handful of sweet chocolate chips." She cheered as the boys erupted into another fit of laughter. She pulled a hidden bag of chocolate chips from behind the toaster, scattering them across the warm plates like sweet confetti. Arthur felt a sudden, sharp pang of intense jealousy piercing through his chest. A bitter jealousy directed at the beautiful, seamless connection they shared. He felt a profound envy that a humble domestic worker earning a modest wage could effortlessly bring a level of happiness to his sons that his millions couldn't. He looked at his life and realized how utterly lonely and hollow his existence had become between endless corporate meetings, international flights, and a demanding fiancé. He knew deep down that Khloe cared infinitely more about the unlimited spending limit on his black credit card than she ever would about his sweet sons. Wishing to digest these overwhelming emotions in private, Arthur took a careful step backward into the shadows, intending to retreat silently to his private study upstairs. But fate had an entirely different plan for Arthur that afternoon, as his heavy heel accidentally collided with a large, decorative ceramic vase resting on a side table. The expensive vase did not shatter upon impact, but it wobbled violently against the wood, producing a loud, scraping sound that shattered the kitchen's joy. In an instant, the beautiful flow of time inside the kitchen froze completely, and the wonderful sound of children's laughter died a sudden, agonizing death. Victoria spun around toward the open doorway with lightning speed, her eyes wide with a sudden, paralyzing terror that replaced her beautiful smile in a second. She knew with absolute certainty that her wealthy employers were not scheduled to return to the Greenwich estate for at least another 3 full hours. She knew that the pristine kitchen currently looked like a complete disaster area and that the employer's children were standing in a strictly forbidden zone. "Mr. Wright," she choked out in a horribly trembling voice, instinctively raising her flour-covered hands to her mouth as her face drained of all its color. The young twins, sensing the immediate wave of terror washing over Victoria and seeing the imposing figure of their father, reacted completely out of pure instinct. They did not run toward their father for comfort, but instead committed an act that instantly shattered Arthur's fragile heart into 1,000 bloody pieces. They scrambled backward across the counter to hide themselves entirely behind Victoria's legs, seeking protection from their own father as if he were a dangerous monster. The heavy, suffocating silence that descended upon the messy kitchen was completely deafening, broken only by the low, monotonous hum of the massive stainless steel refrigerator. Victoria was as pale as a ghost, her mind racing as she thought of her employment, her livelihood, and her sick mother depending on her. She was entirely convinced that she was about to be fired on the spot for destroying the kitchen and placing the children in danger. "Mr. Wright, please, I can explain everything," she stammered out, lowering her head in a gesture of submission that deeply pained Arthur to see. "You returned home so much earlier than expected, and I am so terribly sorry for this awful mess, but the boys just wanted to learn. I will clean every single inch of this room immediately, and I promise you that everything will be completely spotless in just a few minutes," she wept. Her hands were shaking so violently from pure panic that she accidentally dropped her cleaning cloth onto the floor, bending down frantically to retrieve it. Arthur slowly stepped into the brightly lit kitchen, each of his heavy footsteps echoing loudly against the floor, as Victoria closed her eyes in fear. The children pressed themselves even closer against her uniform, staring at Arthur with wide, distrustful eyes as he finally reached the edge of the island. He extended his right hand slowly, and Victoria flinched away slightly, expecting him to point angrily at a stain. But Arthur did none of those things. Instead, he gently ran his index finger through a small mound of white flour on the counter, staring at his dusted finger with an unreadable expression. He lifted his head to look directly into Victoria's eyes, and despite her intense fear, she returned his gaze with an inspiring, quiet dignity. "Victoria," Arthur said, his deep, resonant voice cutting through the thick silence of the room like a heavy stone dropping into a still pond. "Yes, Mr. Wright, I am so incredibly sorry," she whispered softly, her shoulders trembling as she prepared herself for the inevitable wave of anger. Arthur looked past her to gaze at his 2 sons, who were still watching him with an intense amount of caution and deep suspicion. Then, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, a soft, genuine smile spread across Arthur's face. Not his professional business smile, but a real one. "Tell me, boys, are these homemade pancakes truly as delicious as they look?" he inquired gently, his soft tone melting the tension in the room. The unexpected question hung in the warm air for a moment, leaving Victoria blinking in utter confusion as the twins slowly let go of her apron. "Daddy?" Logan asked in a hesitant, tiny voice, his small brow furrowing as he tried to comprehend his father's sudden, gentle demeanor. "They smell absolutely wonderful," Arthur continued, completely ignoring the monumental disaster surrounding him, as he stepped even closer to the grand kitchen island countertop. "They have a lot of sweet chocolate chips mixed into them, don't they, Samuel?" he asked, prompting the braver twin to take a small step forward. "Yes, Daddy, they are special dinosaur pancakes, and Vicky taught us how to make them roar." The young boy cheered, his fear vanishing completely. Arthur immediately dropped down to his knees, utterly unconcerned that his custom-tailored, incredibly expensive designer suit was resting on a floor covered in white flour. That sounds like an absolutely incredible adventure, and I was wondering if there might be any chance that Daddy could try a piece of it. At those words, the thick blanket of tension that had filled the room popped like a fragile bubble, allowing Victoria to finally breathe. "Yes, Daddy. Try the big one!" the twins shouted with joy, rushing over to the plate to select the best pancake for their father. Arthur accepted the beautifully deformed, slightly undercooked pancake from his son's sticky hands and took a large bite without a single moment of hesitation. It was admittedly a bit doughy in the center and far too sweet for his usual taste, but it tasted like an absolute blessing to him. It tasted like the sweet, long-forgotten essence of a real family, causing him to look up at Victoria over the heads of his boys. "Thank you," he said to her without making a single sound, merely moving his lips to convey the profound depth of his gratitude. Victoria's cheeks instantly flushed a deep crimson, and she nodded her head respectfully, lowering her eyes with a shy, incredibly beautiful smile of relief. But right as Arthur felt a wave of pure, radiant warmth expanding within his chest, a sharp, piercing sound shattered the beautiful moment like a knife. It was the loud, aggressive, and highly impatient ringing of the main gate intercom, echoing through the foyer, signaling a sudden arrival at the estate. The delightful smiles vanished from the children's faces. Victoria froze in terror once again, and Arthur quickly checked his watch with a dark frown. "Arthur, open this gate immediately. I know you are in there because I see Peter's sedan parked in the driveway," Khloe's voice screeched. Arthur's blood ran cold because he knew with absolute certainty that while he had reacted with love, Khloe would bring nothing but pure destruction. The woman whom the estate staff secretly referred to as the wicked witch behind her back was about to march into their beautiful sanctuary of joy. "Oh no, look at me. Look at this room," Victoria whispered in an absolute panic, staring down at her ruined uniform and the mess. "Clean the boys' faces as fast as you can," Arthur commanded urgently, speaking not with anger, but with the desperate tone of a protective accomplice. "I will go out there and do everything in my power to delay her," he promised. But before he could move, it was late. The sharp, rhythmic clicking of expensive high heels began to echo from the front entrance, growing louder and louder as she approached the kitchen. "Arthur, darling, where are you hiding?" Khloe's voice rang out, filled with a sickening, artificial sweetness that she always utilized when she wanted something. "I saw your briefcase in the hall, and it is an absolute miracle that you are home early from your trip, my love. I had to leave the luxury spa early because the masseuse was utterly incompetent and nearly ruined my lower back," she complained loudly as she walked. Victoria was trembling, gathering loose eggshells with frantic, unnatural speed and tossing them into the trash bin as Arthur stepped in front of her. He positioned his tall, imposing frame directly between the kitchen entrance and the domestic worker, acting as a literal human shield for her and his boys. "We are all currently in the kitchen, Khloe," Arthur called out, his voice sounding incredibly flat, cold, and entirely devoid of any real affection. "In the kitchen?" Khloe repeated in a tone of absolute disbelief and profound disgust, her sharp footsteps halting right at the edge of the wide doorway. "What on earth are you doing in the kitchen, Arthur? It smells dreadfully of cheap grease and burnt batter in here." To Arthur, the room smelled like a real home, but to Khloe, it smelled like an unpardonable sin against her high society standards. Her elegant figure appeared in the doorway, looking absolutely immaculate in a tailored cream dress, an expensive designer handbag draped over her forearm. Khloe was undeniably a beautiful woman by societal standards, but her face instantly twisted into a hideous grimace of absolute horror as she looked around. Her sharp, judgmental eyes quickly scanned the room, completely ignoring Arthur's presence as her gaze locked onto the flour covering the imported Italian marble floor. She stared at the messy counters, the dirty dishes, and finally fixed her eyes like a poison dagger directly onto Victoria's trembling form. "What is the meaning of this absolute atrocity?" Khloe hissed through clenched teeth, her body shaking with an intense wave of superficial fury. "Arthur, can someone please tell me what is going on in my house? This place looks like a disgusting pigsty." Arthur took a firm step forward, keeping his body positioned protectively in front of Victoria and his boys as he spoke with forced calm. The boys were incredibly hungry, Khloe, and Victoria was simply teaching them how to cook some homemade pancakes for an afternoon snack, he explained. Khloe immediately cut him off, letting out a loud, incredibly mocking laugh that was filled with a sharp, piercing venom that cut the air. "Oh, please, Arthur, look at them. They are absolutely covered in filth. And look at this floor. It is imported marble, for heaven's sake." She marched forward, carefully avoiding the patches of flour on the floor, as if she were walking through a field of dangerous acid. "You!" she screamed at the top of her lungs, pointing a perfectly manicured finger directly into Victoria's pale, tear-stained face with utter contempt. "You are an utterly incompetent, useless girl. I pay you a generous wage to keep this mansion in a flawless condition, not to destroy it. Who gave you permission to create this disaster? Answer me right now when I am speaking to you. You pathetic little creature," Khloe demanded. Victoria lifted her head slowly, her eyes overflowing with hot tears, yet she managed to speak with an incredible amount of respect and grace. "Miss Khloe, the children simply wanted to learn how to make pancakes, and I only wanted to give them a little bit of happiness." Khloe let out another cruel, mocking laugh that echoed off the cold granite countertops, her eyes flashing with an intense, unyielding hatred for the girl. "You are not employed here to be their friend. You are here to serve us. And you look absolutely ridiculous covered in flour." "That is quite enough, Khloe." Arthur's powerful voice suddenly boomed through the kitchen like a violent thunderclap, causing Khloe to jump backward in shock. "Do not speak to her in that disgusting manner ever again. She did nothing wrong, and she was actually caring for my sons. Which, by the way, is a basic parental duty that you have never once managed to perform since you entered this house," Arthur added. Khloe's face instantly shifted from utter disgust to profound outrage, before she masterfully transitioned into playing the role of a deeply wounded, innocent victim. She dramatically clapped her hand over her heart, gasping for air as she looked at Arthur with wide, tearful eyes that were entirely fake. "How dare you attack me for simply defending the integrity of your beautiful home? She is probably feeding them pure garbage that will make them sick. Come along right now to Mommy Khloe, boys. We are going upstairs immediately to wash your skin with proper antibacterial soap," she ordered, extending her arms. But Samuel and Logan instantly shrank away from her touch, turning around to tightly wrap their tiny arms around Victoria's legs for protection. It was a profound turning point in the dynamic of the household, and Khloe knew she had lost this specific battle to the maid. Her eyes narrowed into tiny slits of pure malice as she realized that the twins viewed the humble worker as their true protector. She forced a rigid, entirely hollow smile onto her face, smoothing down her cream dress as she decided to shift her tactical approach. "Very well, Arthur. Perhaps my reaction was a bit exaggerated due to the immense amount of stress surrounding our upcoming wedding." She sighed softly. "Clean this absolute mess up immediately," she snapped coldly at Victoria before forcefully gripping Arthur's arm to lead him out of the kitchen. But deep within the dark, calculating recesses of Khloe's mind, a truly horrific and brilliant plan was already beginning to take shape. She knew she couldn't convince Arthur to fire Victoria over a simple mess of flour, so she needed to manufacture a crime that was entirely unforgivable. 2 days later, a thick, suffocating blanket of intense tension hung over the entire Greenwich estate, making it difficult for anyone to breathe easily. Khloe had spent the past 48 hours cleverly playing on Arthur's natural fears regarding the safety and security of his motherless twin sons. "I simply do not trust these lower-class domestic workers, Arthur, because poverty frequently drives desperate people to commit terrible crimes," she whispered to him. Arthur had finally relented, allowing a security firm to install a network of advanced hidden cameras throughout the mansion, confident it would prove Victoria's innocence. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon, and Arthur was completely isolated in his grand study, deeply engrossed in an important video conference with wealthy Japanese investors. Resting on the polished mahogany surface of his desk was his most prized material possession, a solid gold Patek Philippe wristwatch. It was a priceless heirloom passed down to him by his late father, valued at well over $200,000 in the luxury market. He had temporarily removed the heavy timepiece from his wrist because the thick gold band was uncomfortable while typing out an analytical financial report. On the upper floor of the mansion, Victoria was completely occupied, gently bathing the twins and singing them a sweet lullaby to keep them calm. Khloe, who had been slinking through the quiet hallways like a predatory wolf hunting its prey, instantly recognized the perfect opportunity she had been waiting for. She silently glided into the dark study while Arthur's back was completely turned toward the door, his ears covered by noise-canceling headphones. Her eyes flashed with an intense combination of greedy satisfaction and pure malice as she reached out her hand to quietly snatch the watch. She slipped the golden watch into the deep pocket of her dress and quickly made her way down to the staff quarters. She located Victoria's worn, faded canvas handbag hanging innocently on a coat hook near the back entrance of the large mansion. With a twisted, victorious smile, she unzipped the bag and buried the priceless watch beneath a small, handmade, crocheted coin purse. "Goodbye forever, Victoria," Khloe whispered maliciously to her own reflection in the hallway mirror, entirely confident that her dark plan was absolutely flawless. What Khloe failed to realize in her arrogance was that a tiny, state-of-the-art camera hidden inside a smoke detector had recorded everything. Later that evening, a massive panic erupted when Arthur discovered that his father's priceless heirloom was completely missing from his mahogany desk. "Khloe, have you seen my father's gold watch anywhere?" he asked, his voice tight with an intense amount of anxiety and growing dread. Khloe played her scripted role to absolute perfection, gasping in shock before lowering her voice into a dramatic, calculated whisper of false concern. "No, my love, I haven't seen it, but I did see Victoria sneaking around your private study earlier while you were in your meeting." Arthur desperately wanted to believe that Victoria was entirely innocent, but the planting of the evidence had been done with expert precision. He called Victoria into the grand living room and requested that she bring her canvas handbag along with her for a routine inspection. The scene that unfolded within the luxurious living room was an absolute nightmare of raw, human suffering and deep, heartbreaking betrayal. Victoria wept uncontrollably, falling to her knees as she swore on the sacred memory of her late father that she had never stolen anything. Khloe stepped forward, brutally ripping the canvas bag from the crying girl's hands and violently dumping its entire contents onto the glass table. A loud, sickening clatter echoed through the room as the solid gold Patek Philippe watch slid across the glass, spinning to a stop. The ensuing silence that descended upon the grand room was completely deafening, suffocating the very air as Victoria stared at the watch in horror. "I knew it! I knew she was nothing more than a disgusting common thief," Khloe screamed triumphantly, her voice echoing up the grand staircase. Up on the landing, the young twins were sobbing bitterly, their tiny hearts breaking, as they watched their beloved nanny get publicly humiliated. Arthur felt his own heart shattering into 1,000 pieces, because to his logical mind, the physical evidence before him was completely undeniable. Desiring to spare his weeping children the horrific sight of a police arrest, Arthur coldly ordered Victoria to leave his property immediately that night. He watched her walk out into the pouring rain in the middle of the night, her spirit completely broken by a crime she didn't commit. The days that followed Victoria's sudden banishment were a living nightmare, turning the Greenwich mansion into a silent, frozen tomb of misery. The twin boys flatly refused to eat their meals, crying themselves to sleep every night as they desperately called out for their beloved Vicky. Khloe tried to force them to eat, but her lack of patience quickly resulted in violent screaming matches and aggressive shoving. "You ungrateful little brats," she would scream at the top of her lungs whenever she believed that Arthur was safely out of earshot. But Arthur was not out of earshot, and the suspicious nature that had made him a billionaire forced him to investigate the truth. On the third afternoon following Victoria's departure, Arthur sat alone in his dark study, a glass of amber whiskey trembling in his hand. An electronic notification flashed onto his computer screen from the security firm, informing him that the new archival footage was ready. He clicked on the file, and what he witnessed on the high-definition video caused him to drop his crystal glass to the floor. He watched in absolute horror as Khloe slunk into his study, stole his father's watch, and maliciously planted it inside Victoria's bag. He fast-forwarded through other recordings, watching Khloe viciously pinch Samuel's arms and violently shove Logan into a dark room when he cried. Arthur realized with a terrifying clarity that he had banished a pure angel from his home, leaving his children at the mercy of a monster. He did not explode into a blind rage. Instead, his immense anger became deathly cold, calculated, and focused entirely on a righteous revenge. He picked up his phone and dialed Peter. "Peter, I need you to locate Victoria's current address immediately, and then I want you to introduce her to Mrs. Eleanor." Mrs. Eleanor was the elegant older owner of the most exclusive luxury fashion boutique in Manhattan, a longtime personal friend of Arthur's late mother. "Tell Eleanor that cost is absolutely no object, and I want Victoria to be styled like a reigning queen for our engagement party tonight." Victoria initially refused to participate, her pride and her gentle soul deeply wounded by the horrific accusation that had been leveled against her. But Arthur personally called her on the phone, dropping all of his billionaire pride as he literally begged for her forgiveness. He explained that he now knew the absolute truth, and he implored her to return for the emotional well-being of his grieving sons. The grand engagement party was a spectacular affair, with the absolute elite of New York and Connecticut high society gathering at the mansion. Khloe Breyer patched through the wealthy crowd in a stunning blood-red designer gown, proudly boasting to everyone about how she saved the estate. Right as the clock struck exactly 8 o'clock in the evening, the massive oak front doors were swung wide open by the staff. Victoria stepped into the brilliant light of the grand foyer, wearing a breathtaking, midnight blue silk gown that flowed elegantly to the marble floor. She looked absolutely magnificent, possessing a timeless grace that instantly captivated every single eye in the crowded room, causing a sudden silence. Khloe immediately flew into an absolute frenzy of wild rage, her face turning bright red as she screamed at the private security guards. "Guards, remove this disgusting common thief from my sight immediately! How dare you walk back into this house?" she bellowed at the top of her lungs. But Arthur calmly stepped forward, gently taking Victoria's hand and raising it to his lips for a respectful kiss before seating her at the table. "Tonight, my dear friends, we are going to discover the absolute, undeniable truth about who is the real thief in this house," Arthur announced. He pressed a button on a small remote control, and a massive projection screen descended from the ceiling in front of the wealthy guests. The high-definition security footage from his study began to play, clearly showing Khloe's theft, her malicious framing of Victoria, and her abuse. The wealthy guests gasped in absolute horror, and Khloe's own mother covered her mouth in deep shame as the damning evidence filled the room. "Our engagement is completely over, Khloe," Arthur said, his cold voice cutting through her desperate, pathetic excuses like a sharp blade of ice. "Pack your luxury belongings and get out of my home right now, before I have the local police department escort you away in handcuffs." Utterly humiliated, abandoned by her wealthy friends, and rejected by her own mother, Khloe fled out into the dark night amidst a chorus of scornful glares. Arthur and Victoria immediately ran up the grand staircase to the children's wing, where Samuel and Logan were waiting anxiously in their room. The moment the twin boys caught sight of their beloved nanny, they let out cries of pure joy, throwing themselves around her neck. That beautiful night, Arthur chose to sleep on a soft blanket spread across the carpeted floor of his children's playroom, keeping a watchful guard. The next morning, Arthur approached Victoria not with a request to return to her domestic cleaning duties, but with a life-changing professional proposal. "I want you to take over the complete management of this entire estate, Victoria, and I am going to personally fund your university education. You possess a magnificent natural gift for child psychology and pedagogy, and it is the exact path you were truly born to pursue in life." Exactly. 1 year later, A vibrant, incredibly joyful birthday celebration was being held in the sprawling, sunlit gardens of the Greenwich estate. The air was filled with the delightful aroma of a summer barbecue, the sounds of children jumping in a massive bouncy castle, and laughter. A bitter, deeply zgorskniała Khloe stood watching from a distance outside the heavy iron gates, staring at the beautiful family life she lost. Arthur walked to the center of the garden, took a wireless microphone in his hand, and dropped down to one knee before Victoria. In front of all their close friends and family, he asked her to become his wife, speaking as a man who found his soul. Concluding this deeply moving story, my dear friends, I want each and every one of you to take a truly profound life lesson away with you. We are currently living in a modern world that is tragically obsessed with judging the absolute worth of a human being based entirely on the thickness of their financial wallet, the luxury brand of their vehicle, or the expensive designer labels stitched into their clothing. Khloe possessed every single material advantage that this world could ever hope to offer an individual. Immense wealth, high social status, and a flawless physical beauty. Yet beneath that glamorous exterior, her soul was completely hollow, empty, and devoid of any real human worth. Victoria, on the other hand, possessed absolutely nothing of material value in this world, owning only her hard-working hands and a boundlessly compassionate heart that was capable of healing a broken family. Yet, when the true test of life arrived, it was this humble, unassuming young woman who proved to be the wealthiest, most radiant soul existing within that massive mansion. True wealth has absolutely nothing to do with the numbers displayed on a digital bank statement, but is defined entirely by how we choose to treat those vulnerable individuals who can offer us absolutely nothing material in return. It is about the profound emotional warmth, the pure kindness, and the genuine love that we unselfishly choose to bring into the dark, grieving spaces of another person's fragile life. Please always remember that while a clever lie might possess the speed to run incredibly fast for a short distance, the absolute truth possesses the eternal endurance to always catch up to it in the end. Never allow the cynical, cold nature of this modern world to terrify you into abandoning your innate goodness or locking your heart away from those who desperately need your light. Because when the final curtain of our lives begins to fall, it is not the sparkling diamonds around our necks or the gold on our wrists that will keep our souls warm in the twilight of old age, but rather the enduring love of those precious individuals for whom we were genuinely, unselfishly good in this life.